Perfect. Okay. Oh, sorry, one ahead of myself. Thanks everyone for joining tonight. I think tonight for me, UK morning, but I think it should be really great. This is a follow-on talk really from a discussion I had with Dr. Alan McCubbin from Monash University recently, where it was presented as a very scientific review of electrolytes and sodium and fluid balance. And Andy's watched that Q&A, and we've had many discussions about it. And Alan is a practitioner as well, and so he gave his sort of review and view on electrolytes and sodium balance. And so what I wanted to do was invite Andy to have a discussion from an applied view of intake for endurance athletes, specifically looking at fluid balance and sodium intake and how that relates to some of the items that we talked about with Alan, and then hopefully we'll go into some other aspects as well. So just so everyone is aware of who we are, my name's Scott Tyndall. I'm co-founder of a company called Fuelin, which is a performance nutrition platform which syncs with Training Peaks, Today's Plan and Final Surge, so that we give periodized nutrition in an easy way for performance or endurance athletes or any athlete to follow. We do place a lot of emphasis on sweat rate testing and carbohydrate capacity, and do a lot of that within the app and help our athletes, get a better understanding of things like sweat rate and fluid requirements. And so it fits really well with Andy. I know Andy very well from his business, which we do recommend their products, and we like their products and like what they're doing in the space. And, I'll let Andy introduce himself and then we can get going.
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, as it says on there, my name's Andy Blow. I'm one of the founders of Precision Fuel and Hydration. We're a company based out of the UK, although we kind of see ourselves as a global company. We have customers and athletes that we work with around the world. We started just over 10 years ago. It was kind of, I was trained as a sports scientist, and I raced to a decent level in triathlon, but my personal Achilles heel with doing endurance racing was sweat loss and sodium loss, and suffering a lot when I was racing long distance events in the heat. And so I went on a personal journey 15 or so years ago to sort of get to the bottom of that, which involved doing some sweat testing and learning what I needed to do from a hydration perspective to get that right. And then that was a very instructive experience for me, because as someone who sweats a lot and loses a lot of sodium, it unlocked my ability to perform in the heat, whereas previously I was spending a lot of time in the medical tent at Ironman races. So that's where the genesis, the idea of the company came from, and kind of over the last 10 years we've been expanding from sweat testing into hydration and fueling products as well.
Perfect. Okay, so what I thought we'd cover today is sweat and sodium and their purpose, just so everyone is aware of that, and then have a talk about some of the factors that we discussed with Alan. And then we're going to talk about sodium concentration and sweat rate, electrolytes, and sort of talking about I guess our experience in terms of working with athletes, and certainly from Andy's experience and what he's done in the field as well. And as I said, if you've got any questions at any time, please jump in. Okay, sweat and sodium. So I thought what we'd do, Andy, is go through these points that were discussed with Alan and just run through, from your perspective, what are you seeing, from the sports science perspective about the stated benefits and then the potential proposed benefits of sodium, electrolytes, fluid balance, and so on. So why don't we start? And the reason I've got crosses and ticks here, this is in relation to what we discussed with Alan and the evidence as he felt was what was available at this time. And I know I had some discussion points around performance in particular. And Andy, if you'd like to jump into that, let's have a chat.
Yeah, so exactly. So what Alan did, and it's worth, if you didn't see the previous Q&A, it's well worth going back and looking at that one, because what Alan did was, Alan's done an amazing deep dive into the existing literature around sweat and sodium loss and sodium replacement and purported benefits for athletes. Now, based on that, he did a literature review, which I think he boiled down to 6 or 7 papers that had been published looking at the performance benefit of endurance athletes taking sodium. He found that many of those papers were quite flawed in their study design. I think there was one that did come up with a strong performance benefit, which I think is a paper from around 2015 or 2017 in Scandinavian Journal of Sports Medicine, which looked at triathletes incidentally and did find quite a substantial performance improvement with sodium ingestion. But the rest of the papers either showed no effect or were flawed, so they couldn't be included. And so from his perspective, he was presenting this viewpoint that, you know, academically speaking, there is no evidence to suggest that sodium improves performance. My take on that is, as your sort of your title alludes to, Scott, is lack of evidence. Does that mean lack of effect? Because one thing which is probably worth addressing early on is that improving performance is kind of different to what we're trying to do with getting sodium replacement correct with athletes. It's not so much improving performance, but it's maintaining performance throughout a long event, where we know that various things happen to the body when you're doing a long endurance event, especially in the heat, one of which is that you sweat a lot and you lose a lot of fluid and potentially a lot of sodium. You also obviously burn a lot of glycogen, you get muscular fatigue, and all of these things combine and cause you potentially to slow down. Now, if the sodium replacement part of it is something which can help, for example, if we go further down the list, avoid hyponatremia and improve blood volume, then in a way that feeds back very strongly to actually say that is going to improve your performance, in the sense that it's going to keep it at a level that's sustainable rather than letting it drop away. And so I think that whilst it's technically correct to put a cross next to that thing, if you're looking at what does the scientific evidence categorically say, it doesn't at the moment. There's not enough research to suggest there is a direct performance benefit. For me, it would be fairer to do what we've done with cramping there and put a question mark next to it, because when you know, Scott, you're well aware that we put a lot of case studies on our website, because we're big believers in the fact that where the science lags behind, you can learn a lot by actually looking at what athletes are doing and producing case studies to look at what they do to support their performance. And we see a lot of athletes who pay a lot of attention to putting sodium replacement in during endurance events. If they don't get that correct, they see a drop off in performance. If they do get it right, they see a maintenance of performance. And I think, you know, so for me as an applied practitioner, and I think I don't want to put words in Alan's mouth because he's not here to speak, but in the beginning of your talk, he said that as a practitioner, he recommends, you know, carbohydrates, fluids, and sodium to endurance athletes. So for me, it was a case of revisiting that one and saying, although the academic evidence is, you know, lacking in that space, putting a cross next to the idea of performance doesn't feel quite right to me. It feels premature. It almost feels like the book's being closed on it. And I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Scott.
I don't think Alan was closing the book on it. I think, as you highlighted, the degree and the quality of the studies to date have been pretty mediocre, and a lot of them are retrospective sort of questionnaires and asking athletes in a fatigue state what they consumed and did it have a positive effect on it. So I think the more recent research which they've been conducting in Monash is going to start to shed a little bit more light, where they're having athletes run continuously on a treadmill for 4 hours. And I think this is the other problem, is that when you look at what athletes are doing in a 70.3 or an Ironman and competing for well over 4 hours, that's where, and again, if you look at the research, it's in the cases of exercising for more than 4 hours where the requirement for fluid replacement and potentially sodium replacement becomes important. Now, conducting a study that can actually allow that to occur is very difficult. So firstly, you've got the issues with actually performing that study, and then we've also got the lack of those studies being performed. So if we go, like, even if we can come back to this slide, but if we have a look at, and this was a really good slide, I thought, that Alan presented, because what you see there is that red line is the percentage of body mass lost. So a lot of people will talk about 2% of body weight loss as being this magic number where you'll see physiological drop off or reduction in performance. Now, I can tell you now that yes, that may be the case, but you're going to get many, many athletes at the end of a 70.3 or an Ironman who well past 2% body weight loss. For me as a practitioner, I'd probably say, look, you could probably go to 3, potentially even 4% body weight loss and still do pretty well. It means you're not going to feel very good at the end of the race, but you certainly haven't left anything on the course. So, you're going to be all right at the end as long as you don't go too far into a body weight loss. But what this is highlighting is that for these types of athletes, like, in order to maintain, if you look at the time there, you're looking at somewhere between 50 and 75% of fluid loss for a 4-hour event. Now, not too many athletes are going to complete a 70.3 in 4 hours either, are they, Andy? So, you start to shift along to the 5-hour mark, and then you're going, okay, well, you want to be replacing somewhere around that 70, somewhere 60 to 70% of your fluid loss in order to maintain body mass. And then you start saying, okay, well, how important is fluid replacement? And then throwing on top of that, how important is sodium replacement, which is, I guess, where we sort of sit, and I get it, because I think where some of this is lost in translation is, like, if you're training and your training sessions only go for 60 minutes, maybe 2 hours, do you have to push fluids into you? I mean, do you think you need to? No. However, if you're doing that training in order to prepare for an event that goes for more than 4 hours, then you need to start thinking about training the gut. And so you need to then start practicing what your fluid replacements are from a hydration perspective, but also from a carbohydrate perspective, if carbohydrates are going to be consumed in liquid form. And I think this is where it all gets a little bit hazy in the science, isn't it? Because they look at one particular marker, and I would say anyone who's going out there 60 minutes, 90 minutes, I mean, I've done plenty of runs where I don't consume anything and go for 90 minutes. Is that detrimental to my performance? Potentially. Is it going to kill me? No. Is it going to set me up for improving my 70.3 or my Ironman effort by not understanding my fluid replacement requirements? No, I don't believe so. And I think that's
I think that's a really good point, Scott, because I think a lot of the time where that's where it comes unstuck for people is the fact that when you're training for very long ultra endurance events, obviously a lot of the time, your training sessions don't cross over into that territory of beyond 4 or 5 hours, where there's a lot stronger evidence that sodium replacement along with fluid is going to be necessary. So people don't get in the habit of practicing it, understanding what levels required. And so on race day, and race days are obviously relatively more infrequent if you're doing, say, half or full Ironman or ultra marathon, that you end up having to use those race experiences as individual tests where and then it's a bit of a crapshoot as to whether you get it right or wrong. And I think what Alan did a very good job of explaining, which is still a difficult concept to get your head around, is the fact that sodium needs, regardless to an extent of sweat sodium loss, start to escalate pretty dramatically as the percentage of fluid taken in increases, which is exactly this next slide. And the fact that therefore your sweat sodium has an impact on this, because the more sodium you lose, the quicker and easier it is to dilute your blood sodium levels down, because obviously the rate of loss is greater. It's also very tied in with the volume of fluid replacement, and we know that that's all over the map for different people. And really, this is where the biggest practical understanding challenge is for most people, is the fact that, especially as things get longer, you not only probably need more percentage of fluid replacing, but also a higher percentage of your sodium losses replacing, because you're getting closer to emptying the tank. So you can go from a situation where you can make a pretty strong argument for the fact that, yeah, a lot of people don't require any sodium replacement if they're doing relatively shorter events or in cooler conditions, right through to having to make really what look like very aggressive fluid and sodium recommendations for people who sweat a lot in very hot conditions. And it's a little bit less easy to understand than, say, carbohydrate recommendations, which are a lot more linear and a lot more just, you know, kind of hours work being done requires X amount of fuel. The fluid and sodium are intrinsically coupled. Talking from personal experience here, the two things that I had to do when I learned that how much I sweat and how much sodium I lost as an athlete, I was previously replacing a very high percentage of my fluid losses without sufficient sodium. And it was actually a combination of increasing sodium, but also reducing total fluid volume that proved to be the best tactic for me. Because
and that's a great, and that's what this graph really highlights for me is like, if you're really shit at replacing your fluids, then potentially you don't need to take in a lot of sodium, because if you think about it, the bucket is getting lower, but the concentration of the sodium within your blood is staying, well, it's getting relatively more concentrated because you're not replacing the fluid. Yeah. And so this is where the sweat rate becomes so important for an individual to understand. I sort of think more so than your sodium concentration to a degree, because I think what I'm seeing is a lot of people over consuming fluids, and they're going into race thinking, I've got to drink. And then they wonder why they get upper GI complaints like burping, belching, vomiting. It's because they're trying to put too much fluid into their stomach, and it's not emptying at the rate at which it has to, because they actually are not producing the heat inside them, which is invariably why they're not actually sweating that much, because they're not producing the power and they're still forcing the fluid in. And so if you don't have a good understanding of your sweat rate, and it's very different, just so everyone listening on the call, your sweat rate is the rate at which you lose bodily fluids. Your sweat sodium concentration is a measure of the sodium in your sweat relative, and it should be relative to total body sodium concentration. But that is what Andy's machine does, and we're going to talk about that, and Andy will touch on like what the precision hydration machine is. And there are plenty of other ways of, and we'll discuss that in terms of assessing sweat sodium concentration. But when we're talking about sweat rate, that can be estimated again through the machine and through patches, but it can also simply be done by weighing yourself before and after sessions and recording what you're drinking, what products you consumed, and whether you went to the toilet, and working out percentage of body weight loss. And doing that repeatedly is really important, because there will be wild fluctuations in terms of sweat rate as well, based on effort, based on whether it's a bike or a run, based on external temperature, based on humidity and that. And so I think, just so everyone is aware of that, it is really important, because when you look at this graph, if you're not replacing 70 to 80% of your fluid, the likelihood is, if you're in that 50 to 60%, you'll probably maintain decent blood sodium concentration. That's how I read this graph. Is that how you see it as well, Andy?
Yeah, it is that is technically true. And I think that and it's an argument that gets pushed sometimes. It's an argument that can get pushed too far in one direction, in that, and some of the, if people have come across Tim Noakes's book Waterlogged, where he talks about the maintenance of blood sodium, and makes this argument very strongly that essentially athletes, his argument is very, very very forthright around the point that he believes people don't need to replace sodium at all. That was his stance on it, which is quite an extreme viewpoint. But he leans on this argument that your sweat is essentially less concentrated than your blood in terms of sodium. So as you progressively dehydrate, your sodium levels in the blood will rise. Therefore, a small correction of that with plain water will be enough to just sort of maintain serum osmolality. But where this becomes problematic, in my view, for longer distance endurance athletes, especially in the heat, is that we don't place enough emphasis on the benefit of maintaining blood volume, because it's then we're in this game of what you were talking about initially, 2%, 3%. In fact, the next slide, the 2% body weight loss, 3% body weight loss. There needs to be, these two factors need to be counterbalanced against each other. I totally agree that we do see hyponatremia a lot of the time because of over drinking. People over consume fluid because they're worried about, not replacing enough, and that leads them to dilute their sodium levels. But at the same time, if you use the argument that, okay, well, if you just, the classic one is just drink to thirst, because the serum osmolality is what drives your thirst predominantly. If you just drink when you're thirsty, you'll replace enough fluid to keep your blood sodium levels balanced, and therefore you don't need to worry about additional sodium. But that begs that question: what about blood volume? Because at some point, if you're doing an Ironman for 9, 10, 11 hours, and you're in the example on the next graph, we've got someone who's sweating 1 liter an hour. That is a reasonably average sweat rate for an adult, exercising in normal conditions. But we know that a lot of these events, so Chris Harris, who's a guy who's a sports scientist on our team, he's out in Dallas at the moment preparing for the Ironman World Championships. It's like 35 degrees Celsius, it's 80% humidity. He's been recording his fluid losses on the bike, going out for 2-3 hour acclimatization sessions, easily sweating out 2.5 liters an hour comfortably. And he's a guy with a reasonably big sweat rate, but he's not off the charts, and he only weighs about 70 kilos. So all of a sudden then, the tilt on the graph starts to come back much more towards higher percentages of fluid replacement, because otherwise, quite simply, your blood volume gets way too compromised way too quickly and your performance drops off. So there's all of these confounding factors which make essentially make the question, how much fluid, how much sodium should I take, very, very difficult to. There's certainly no one size fits all answer, and there's not even one percentage fits all answer, because it depends on the net total loss. And I suppose to sort of try and bring that one full circle to a degree, I definitely agree with you, Scott, that therefore having a handle, if you're an endurance athlete doing long events, having a handle on what your total sweat rate is extremely important. Because if your total sweat losses are in the region of, let's say, 500 milliliters to 1,000 milliliters an hour, that for me puts you in the camp of being a very low to sort of moderate sweater. And this whole discussion becomes a lot more easy for you, because actually you're not going to have to replace an extraordinary amount, a percentage of those fluid losses and sodium losses in order to maintain performance. If you're on the much, much higher end, and we see a lot of people whose sweat rates are above 2 liters an hour. We see a lot of people whose sweat sodium concentrations are very high as well. Then the prescription for those people with heavy losses can be aiming for a much higher percentage of replacement. And then that compounds the fact that you've got to replace a large amount of sodium.
Yep. Yeah. And I will just say on that as well, just from my practical experience, I don't tend to see women with extreme, not as high as men. And now I know in the literature, again, women at sub-max exercise will tend to have similar sweat rates as males. At max effort, they will have lower sweat rates than males. And this is due to probably the efficiency of sweat glands as opposed to the density of the sweat glands that women have. But it is something to factor in, as well as, I think, again, what I've seen from anecdotally is that quite a lot with women, if we get them actually understanding what their sweat rate is, they suddenly find they don't have to drink so much on the bike, and then just consume a moderate amount of sodium. If they've had the test done, then usually, again, we will tend to recommend somewhere around that 50 to 70% of their total sweat concentration that's been given to them. But they will then adjust that based on, again, how they feel. And I think this is, again, like what we've talked about, Andy, is like, it's guardrails. And you even hinted then, it's like your sweat rate might be 500 to 900 mils an hour. It's not like
Yeah.
you sweat 670 mils an hour, guys. Like, you are going to have guardrails, if you want to call it that, based on the intensity, Z1, Z2, Z3 plus, on the bike, on the run, less than 30 degrees Celsius or 85 Fahrenheit, and greater than 85 Fahrenheit or greater than 30 degrees Celsius. And you as an athlete need to start to actually understand where you sit with those different parameters in order to then manage your fluid appropriately. Like, Andy can't tell you exactly what it is. I can't tell you exactly what it is. It does come down to a bit of like N=1. You be the scientist and you be your own test subject and repeatedly test yourself to see actually how things go.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's a great point. The fact that what you're trying to do is with any sweat testing, whether it's sodium concentration testing or sweat rate testing, we tend to use this idea of putting yourself in different buckets. You know, you can be, and the buckets have two things in them. You can be a low sweat rate person and a low sweat sodium person, but you could also be a low sweat rate person and a high sweat sodium concentration person. You could also be a moderate sweat rate and a low sweat sodium, or a moderate sweat rate and a high sweat sodium, and so on and so, you know, right through. And the people for whom this discussion is slam dunk most relevant are those with high sweat rates and high sweat sodium concentrations. But it's also extremely relevant to people with simply high sweat rates, especially if they're going for long periods of time, because of that fact that we've alluded to around, you know, maintaining blood volume, because you've got that total loss. And actually a good real life example of one of those people is to not to counter, but just to give another perspective on your point about the female athletes, is Emma Pallant-Brown, who's obviously a top world-class 70.3 athlete, who's typically had a lot of problems racing in the heat because of her sweat rate. Now, we've done a lot of sweat testing with Emma. We know that her sweat rate can definitely exceed 2 liters an hour quite comfortably. And she's obviously extremely fit, puts out a lot of power on the bike and runs extremely fast, which cause a lot of metabolic heat production and drive that sweat rate on. She actually doesn't have a particularly high sweat sodium concentration. She's quite a bit lower than average. But what we found through trial and error, through experimentation, is that if she doesn't replace a high volume of those fluid losses, a high percentage of those fluid losses, she can go into kind of hypovolemic shock type situations like she did in Miami when she collapsed. And the way that appears to work to counter that is to be quite aggressive with the sodium along with the fluid to help keep that blood volume up. Because for her, it appears to be, whenever she's been admitted to hospital, she's been treated for severe low blood pressure, and, you know, which is consistent with low blood volume.
Well, that relates to, you know, what is proven in the literature is that intake of sodium is going to improve thirst. Yeah. And so I think to that point, like Andy, that is a really good reason sometimes to have sodium in your fluids, because menstrual cycle, my understanding is, I think the luteal phase thirst is reduced in females. You can correct me if I'm wrong. So relying on thirst, if you are a female in that later period of your menstrual cycle, could actually be misleading in terms of what your requirements are. So there could be that consideration. If you do have sodium, and I experienced this, I had some electrolytes. I was just doing a spin class the other day, and I had too much sodium in my bottle, but I went through probably two and a half bottles in an hour because it made me so thirsty. So there is potentially a point to increasing the sodium content in a drink to make it more salty, in the case if you are a very big sweater, to actually ensure that you are taking in that fluid. And again, does the science support that? I don't know if it does, but certainly anecdotally, it can improve performance because you suddenly stop that individual collapsing. And so, indirectly you're improving performance, but it's not I think to what you were saying as well, like sodium is not like carbohydrates. You don't take sodium to run faster, but it's part of the puzzle that could stop you from cramping, from, having low blood pressure, from going into, hypovolemic shock, and all these things that ultimately will improve your performance because it allows you to actually, finish the race. So I think again, the definition of performance, as you say, is a little bit varied in the literature at this point in time. Let's move on. Do you want to just talk through? I know this was part of something you wanted to discuss about sodium delivery and sort of, fluids versus, or solution versus capsules, pills, and what your experience in that is.
Yeah, I thought we'd bring this one up because a lot of people, if you accept the fact that for you in the situation you're in your physiology, that taking in sodium during an event is important, then there's two main ways in which to do it. One of which is to drink a drink with a known concentration of sodium in it, like a sports drink, an electrolyte drink, or whatever kind of beverage it is. And then the other way, which is commonly used, is to take capsules or pills with a known quantity of sodium in and obviously wash them down with liquids. And both have pros and cons. I read a lot of stuff, particularly around the idea of capsules and pills, a lot of negativity from some people around the risks and drawbacks. But I think it's important to balance those against some of the potential upsides of using them. And so, but starting with drinks and solutions, I think one of the major benefits to drinking your electrolytes in your fluids is that you are very, very unlikely to drive a situation of hypernatremia, which is where you inadvertently increase the sodium levels in your blood by drinking a salty solution. Because even people who have relatively salty sweat, it's way less salty than your blood, so your blood sodium levels are going to rise, and a sports drink is generally way more dilute than that. So by putting your electrolytes in a drink, you're always going to take them with a reasonably appropriate level of fluid, and so you're more likely to dilute your blood further, even if it's by a lesser extent if you put more sodium in it than by overdoing it. There are obviously exceptions to this. You can, if you overmix or make an over strong bottle, and you're someone with a low sweat sodium concentration, you could be putting more sodium in than you're taking out, but you're still putting in a large amount of water with it, so you're unlikely to cause a catastrophic rise, in your sodium. What I would say to people when you're drinking sodium-rich drinks in an event, one way to sort of start to understand whether you're better off sticking with those or moving to water is to listen to your taste, like you were describing, Scott. You're having an electrolyte drink. It's starting to taste, if it tastes really good and it feels like it's going down well, the chances are, if it's quenching your thirst, then you are requiring that sodium and your body is giving you all of the signals, the biofeedback that's working. When it starts to taste salty and nasty salty, or when you start to crave plain water, that's a really good sign that actually your sodium levels are rising and that you're better off then listening to your body and diluting it down with some plain water, which is why, particularly in ultra distance events, we often recommend people maintain access to water and electrolyte drinks to listen to their taste buds and make sure that you feel like you understand what your body's asking you for at a point in time. And so having sodium in your drinks is a safe way of making sure you get your electrolyte dosing pretty much right without risking overdoing it dramatically. In terms of risks, the biggest risk is the one that's been highlighted many, many times around hypernatremia. The fact that even a relatively salty sports drink is considerably less salty than your blood, so will have a net diluting effect on your system if you overdrink it. So people have overdrunk sports drinks in the past, believing that because they've got some sodium in them, they're protected from hypernatremia, and that's just not the case. Any time when your fluid intake exceeds your fluid loss, and if that fluid is less salty than your blood, and your blood is at 3,600 milligrams of sodium per liter, so there are no sports drinks that go that strong, you're going to end up diluting it down. So I think the risk of just drinking in solutions is mainly that you can still dilute yourself if you overconsume in terms of fluid volume. The other thing, which is not necessarily a risk, but which is a drawback to using sodium in drinks, is obviously if you're in a non-stop moving event like an Ironman or a triathlon, where you start the bike ride, say, with 3 bottles maybe full of whatever your preferred drink is, at some point you're going to have to pick other things up off the course. And if you're moving very fast, you're not going to be mixing up fresh drinks as you go. Some athletes will, if they're moving a bit slower, they'll put tablets in a front aero bottle, or even put them in a frame bottle when they're going along. But generally, you get to a point where, you know, you're going to have to pick up whatever's available on course. And if that's not of the right kind of concentration to suit you, then you need to look at alternatives, which is where the capsules and pills can come in. Because at that point, the big benefit for me of the capsules and pills is that you can carry them easily about your person. You can continue to take electrolytes in during a long race at a ratio that works for you without having to stop and faff around mixing stuff up. And I think that's probably one of the principal advantages that they offer. And I don't know if you got anything to add on that particular bit, Scott.
Yeah, I think, look, again, I mean, what you're seeing in a lot of the products as well is that, you know, you will see sodium to varying degrees in some of the products, gels, blocks and whatnot. And yeah, depending again on how much the athlete requires. I mean, I've seen some gels with 250, 300 milligrams of sodium in them, and that actually becomes problematic, especially if your carbohydrate intake is now getting up to sort of 70 to 90 grams an hour on the run. So that's a consideration as well. I think for, you know, obviously your gels don't have, gels and chews don't have any sodium in them. That's correct, isn't it?
That's correct,
so,
yeah.
So in that case, you know, what I just anecdotally speaking is, you know, athletes will consume a salt capsule with those products, knowing that some form of carbohydrate is required in order for sodium and carbohydrate to be transported. And that is an important consideration. And, you know, I always think about this is like, you know, the gut or the stomach doesn't know when you're actually having, you know, some carbohydrate or some sodium, particularly, like, as long as they're probably within 10 minutes of each other, there's going to be that ongoing mishmash of carbohydrates and sodium in the gut. And so I think it just comes down to what works for the athlete, again, based on carbohydrate delivery, sodium delivery, and what their actual requirements are in order to actually maintain a high performance. So I think solution works really well on the bike. I find it doesn't work so well on the run, you know, unless you're prepared to carry a bottle, maybe a concentrated bottle, which can lead to problems, as you said. I personally recommend that athletes drink water on the run. If they're consuming products with sodium, they're probably going to be all right on the run, unless they're very sweaty, like salty sweater with a high salt rate. Then they will probably then consume salt capsules in conjunction with carbohydrate. And that's generally how we manage it. Is that scientific? Probably get a lot of arguments against it, but does it work? Yes, it does. And I think there's got to be more science to sort of, you know, research to support what's actually going on in practice.
Yeah, and I think going back on the capsules and pills, one of the big perceived risks, which is a very valid one, is the fact that if you don't have a good handle on how much sodium is in a particular capsule or product that you're taking, or if you're just overly aggressive with taking them without enough water or without enough fluid, you definitely can run the risk of making yourself feel quite sick and nauseous, you know, because if you put 3 or 4, the typical scenario you see is that someone is deep into a race, they maybe feel like they're starting to cramp, or they're starting to feel like they're underperforming for some reason. They decide that sodium or salt is what they need, and then rather than taking a sensible amount, you know, taking a capsule or 2 with a requisite amount of water, they end up popping 4 or 5 capsules in a bit of a panic, and then obviously they take 5 or 10 minutes to start to dissolve in the stomach. You then get a big hit of sodium. It can make you feel quite queasy. It might give you diarrhea or sickness. It might make you extremely thirsty, because if you're going to pull a lot of sodium through into the bloodstream. So it's really, when you decouple the sodium intake from the fluid intake, you've just got to make sure that you are keeping a mental ledger of what's going in. And we always kind of recommend for athletes that are moving fast, if you're relying on your capsules, your salt capsules on the run, the idea is, first off, you need a very rough idea, at least, of how many you're likely to require per hour. You know, you need to know what the sodium concentration is, what the kind of target amount of sodium is you think you're going to need per hour, and then you obviously stagger those out. If there's frequent aid stations, it's good to pop a sodium capsule into your mouth as you approach the aid station, so that you can, if you can swallow it without water, great, swallow it. If not, you're going to pick up a cup or a bottle of water or a dilute sports drink or Coke as you go through, and then make sure that you drink that with the capsule. The dangerous thing to do is just be popping capsules left, right, and center without a lot of fluid. So staggering them out, knowing how many you need, what's in them, staggering them out and taking them at an aid station where you can definitely wash them down with fluid is a very sensible approach to that.
And then that comes back to, again, like what we were talking about at the start. Yes, you may not need this in training because your training sessions are only an hour, 2 hours long. But if you plan on using this in a race, you need to understand how it makes you feel in training at race pace. So you need to practice this. And I would say, you know, again, what I tend to recommend, just because of the physiology of carbohydrates and sodium transport, I tend to recommend that they take the gel and then pop the capsule after that. So that tends to be the order in which I do it. Could it be capsule then gel? Probably. I find that people just find it easier to have the gel as they're approaching the aid station, pop the capsule in, drink the water as they go through and keep going. So yeah, but it's all about repetitive practice is, I think, the take home. I thought I think we've touched on that sweat sodium continuum as well. And I know I read through a case study you presented, and maybe we don't have time for that. I think what was I going to say about the continuum? I was going to say that I think like what we see with athletes is, as you highlighted, you can be a very heavy sweater. You lose a lot of fluid, but maybe aren't very salty. And so what that then comes down to is managing your fluid balance. Whereas you could have the other person who is a very low sweater, but maybe potentially very salty. And so if you manage your low sweat rate, which may not require a lot of fluid to be taken in, but still 70%, but you are potentially losing a lot of sodium, you still need to manage that appropriately so that you're not dropping down and potentially suffering from some of these other effects of, you know, feeling lightheaded, cramping in the stomach, cramping in the musculoskeletal system, things like that. So again, I think you do have this sort of, you know, differentiation between athletes. And I think that's what you have talked about, Andy, in terms of, you know, this wide range of athletes and how they present. And actually, again, how do you research that? Because it is difficult because there's so much, you know, I think we'll find ranges like what you said, you know, low sweater, high salt concentration or high sodium concentration, low sweater, you know, low concentration. Maybe these buckets is where people need to be put into in order to then manage their hydration sort of strategy in races.
Yeah, honestly, a lot of the work we do with individuals is to take data points about their sweat sodium concentration and their sweat rate in different conditions, as well as looking at it mathematically to say, okay, what kind of percentage replacement might be required in this scenario. A lot of what we do is we'll look at other examples. We'll find other athletes who show similar characteristics or maybe doing similar, and that's where the case study database that we've got comes in. It's like, okay, well, have we seen this type of athlete before? What appears to have worked? What appears to not have worked so well? And then use that guidance to sort of as a starting point for that individualized trial and error. And the concept of the continuum, we have definitely inadvertently kind of covered it and touched on it. But just to be clear with people about that, I do believe it's a really useful thought experiment to just consider that a big reason why there's this confusion and controversy around fluid and sodium replacement for athletes is because you've got a continuum where at one end, at the far right of the continuum, if you like, at the extreme end, you've got people who have very, very high sweat rates, along with very, very high sweat sodium concentrations, who do very long and hot events. And those people require an extremely aggressive and proactive and pre-planned strategy to replace enough fluid and enough sodium to maintain their performance. At the opposite end of the spectrum, even if we take shorter events out of the equation, because they're simply not long enough to warrant discussion about hydration and sodium replacement, you can have athletes with relatively lower sweat rates and relatively low sweat sodium concentrations for whom the replacement of fluid and sodium is a very minor concern. And as long as they do what the kind of drink to thirst literature says, and they listen to their body and they drink a bit when they're thirsty, they can skate by on really, really quite minimal intakes. You know, we've published data recently on Ash Gentle, who's obviously one of the top triathletes in the world these days, racing very, very well this year. She's been winning. She's won all of the events she's done on the PTO tour, numerous 70.3s, hot conditions. She won in Miami at the start of the year. And looking at her, she consumes a high amount of carbohydrate in her races, but typically not a lot of fluid, not a lot of sodium. She scoots by, even in Dallas the other week, where it was mid-30s, extremely hot. She ran an amazing, I think she ran about 105 on the 18K run. And I think her fluid consumption was like 300 odd milliliters an hour, you know, in an event like that. And we've had a few people contact us and say, really, is that really, you know, how confident are you of that? Is it really true? And, you know, we had a team on the ground there who are working with her, who she's experienced athlete who knows we're collecting this data. So she does a good job of estimating what she takes in. And she's one of those people that appears to be able to be very well adapted to racing in those conditions. We've got similar data on other athletes who I wouldn't say always don't necessarily perform as well in the heat, but who definitely seem to require more fluid and sodium to keep them going. Some of them are drinking like 3 or 4 times that per hour in those similar conditions. And so that idea of the continuum, of realizing that the reason you hear so much conflicting advice from so many people is because where they are as individuals, or where their experience of that continuum is mainly based, is going to influence what they think about this. And I put myself in that bracket as well, because when I came at this, I am on the far right of that continuum. I am high sweat rate, high sodium loss. And when I first found out about that, changed what I was doing in terms of fluid intake and taking in a lot more sodium, the difference it made to my performance was like nothing short of revolutionary. I was able to race in the heat to the level that I felt my fitness was capable of, as opposed to cramping up and walking the run and often checking myself in for an IV at the end. And so my view on this is, I have to accept it's skewed to a degree that, for me, this was a big performance unlock. And it's, you know, certainly I'll hold my hand up and say 12, 15 years ago, I was an evangelist of pushing this to everybody because it worked for me. I was very blinkered in that view that this is like a universal truth. Working with it over 10, 12 years, seeing a lot of different athletes and all the rest of it, that idea of the continuum and accepting that what we've got to do with an athlete is find out where you sit on that continuum, and then we can look at appropriate levels of replacement, which, as I say, go from virtually nil right through to like extremely aggressive.
Yeah.
That, if we can accept that as a starting point for a discussion, then I think it becomes more productive for an individual athlete, because then it's all about, okay, we're not trying to argue on whether this is right or wrong. We're trying to argue on like, where do you fit into that picture?
And you've only got to go on chat rooms and chat groups and things like that to see, you know, the person who it worked for, and then they push that point of view to say this is the only way. And it's a bit like, you know, I'll talk about macronutrients and things. Whenever you hear someone saying, look, this macronutrient is the only way forward, it's like, walk away, because you're going to respond to different things in different ways. So you, again, comes back to work out where you are on this, you know, continuum, on this spectrum, you know, and it is quite variable. Like we can lump you in buckets: low sweater, moderate sweater, high sweater, you know, low, moderate, high sodium concentration, but you will be somewhere around there, and you'll have to work it out along his way. In terms of, I know this is Luke's scorecard. Like, do we want to talk about it, or do you want to keep moving on?
I can go over it in like 30 seconds flat,
Yeah.
so that we don't get too bogged down in it. Because if anyone wants to view this in more detail, it's on our website. If you go into the athlete section in the top menu bar and you look at case studies, there's a lot of case studies, but if you go far enough back through, you'll find this one for Luke, who's an Aussie triathlete, who a good age group triathlete. He went, in this instance, 9 hours 22 for 4th place at Ironman Western Australia. But Luke's an interesting case for me because he's one of these he's one of these people that a lot of the academic researchers who look into this area tend to think doesn't exist. So Luke sweats at well in excess of 2 to 2.5 litres an hour. And his sweat sodium concentration we've measured it multiple times at over 2,000 milligrams per litre. So 2,100 milligrams per litre. He is a really, really salty guy. And Luke came to us because he tried to do lots of Ironman races. And his wife had basically said, you have to stop because you've literally hospitalised every time with problems associated with hyponatremia and hypovolemia. So like loss of blood volume and low blood sodium. The numbers that he's taken in there in a race, you can see 1.3 litres of fluid an hour on average with a relative sodium concentration of over 2,000 milligrams per litre. And even when I looked at putting this plan together with Luke, was nervous about recommending any human to take in this amount of fluid and salt during a race. But all of the evidence that we'd got from testing suggested that all of his problems are related to catastrophic fluid and sodium loss. So let's put a really large amount back in and let's see how he goes. And Luke's done this, and he's done it a couple more times since and gone from like virtually DNFing to coming 4th in his age group, 9:22. And I always feel a bit self-conscious putting a example like this up in a way, because it seems like it could easily be interpreted that we're pushing people to push a high amount of fluid and a high amount of sodium. But what I'm actually trying to do here is bring to life that far right end of the continuum and saying that, look, if he's got these massive losses and this massive amount of replacement allows him to maintain performance, then even if your losses aren't quite as massive as that, but they're big, these numbers give you an idea of where the direction in which you might want to be pushing to. These I would see as being on the outer limits of what I've ever seen, but they worked for this individual. And I think just that's the reason why I think these kind of things are worth highlighting, and not that there's something to be copied, but there's something to be instructive, on where the continuum lies.
So you said his estimated sweat rate is what, around 2 litres?
2 to 2.5 litres.
Yeah.
That's from a decent amount of testing and training. So going out, doing long bike rides at Ironman Power in the heat and weighing himself.
If you look at this, he took in about 67%, if you want to get really picky, somewhere between 60 and 70% of his fluid loss. So if we go back to that first graph, he did really well. Now, the question I've got, and this is, and again, I know we've discussed this, is like, okay, you get a sweat sodium concentration, which is off the forearm, it's site specific. Now, your machine at this point in time doesn't equate that to total body sodium. Is that correct? So it may read.
Yeah, it may read. So yeah, that's an interesting point, because when you take sweat sodium readings from multiple sites in the body, you get a mixture of different results. And it's, as Alan was pointing out, there are potentially algorithms that you can use to correct for that, to total body sweat loss. And some sites are better than others. Now, when we started doing our testing many years ago, those algorithms weren't published, they weren't available, and we started to look at this stuff very literally. Now, it appears that the forearm, from where we take the reading, if anything, would tend to overestimate rather than underestimate for total body sweat losses, depending who you talk to and depending what kind of opinion you get. That's
what I've read as well. That
there's no consensus on how much above, or well, I suppose there isn't if you believe the algorithm, but they were done on relatively smaller groups of people. What I would say is that the data that Alan presented, which was interesting, was that a typical range that he would see for a corrected, if you took a group of people, a large enough sample size of people, you would see sweat sodium readings from somewhere between 20 to 80 millimoles per litre as a kind of rough range. Now, our data set for forearm sweat samples is vast. It's like, I think it's approaching 15,000 athletes now. So it's really substantial. And the average from the forearm that we've got is around about 47 at the moment, 47 millimoles. So that does indicate it's a little bit higher than the total body. If Alan's kind of rough, like 40 as the midpoint figure is to be believed.
So 47 would put you at 1,000, just over 1,000 milligrams per liter. You times it by 23, don't you?
You do. Although we apply a small correction factor with ours that brings it down because of the way the machine works. It measures total electrolyte content rather than just sodium.
Yeah.
So we would bring it. If we wanted to talk about it in milligrams per liter, it's around about 929 milligrams per liter is the middle of our data set. Which, although that is a small overestimation, it's not. It doesn't feel to me like it's a massive overestimation. You know, to Alan's point that he sees, you know, he said people up at 80 are, you know, rare, and going above that, we've seen they are relatively rare, but I think, you know, our data set in some ways you could argue is subject to bias, because typically people who are having problems with sweat and sodium seek out for a test. So, but I would like to think in the vast amount of data we've got now, some of that noise is kind of cancelled out. But I would say it's slightly more common than is reported in the literature that for people to have higher sweat sodium concentrations than that. I mean, mine typically reads around about 90 millimoles per liter. And that's very consistent over the years. We've seen a number of people over 100. But yeah, as I say, that range appears to be, you know, Alan's range of 20 to 80. I'd argue we've seen people down in the high teens and up to the low hundreds. And there's obviously, this is a bell curve, so it tails off. The people in those extremes, like the fact that the forearm overreads ever so slightly, I think is valid, but I think it is ever so slightly based on eyeballing the data. And in some ways, it depends where you sit on this. But you know, when you spoke to Alan, I think you touched on like what happens if I take too much sodium. Well, in my view, if you take a little bit more sodium than you need, there are very few downsides and potential upsides around maintenance of blood volume, replacement of what you're losing, that maintaining thirst drive, those kind of things. If you significantly undershoot on your sodium and you need it, then you get all of those problems that we talked about, you know, around cramping, potentially around blood volume dropping and that kind of thing. So having an estimate that is ever so slightly over rather than under doesn't necessarily feel like a bad thing. And but I also appreciate that the idea of saying to a human, or any human, especially an athlete, that taking a little bit more of something is better than taking less can become a bit of an arms race, because it's like, well, what is a little bit more? Is it double the recommendation? Is it, you know,
and I guess that's what I'm interested in. Like, if you did equate this to total body sodium concentration, what numbers would come out? And then if we go back to a lot of the graphs, and something, I don't think I showed a graph, but my understanding is the sodium level, and this makes sense to me as well. If you're losing an amount like fluid, for instance, we don't recommend you replace 100% of the fluid. So should we, and I guess this is, again, practically how I use your information, I tend to start them at lower volume, 50 to 60% of that sodium concentration that is provided to them. I will recommend, so if they're testing at, 1,500 milligrams, I will probably say start with 750.
Yeah.
And then start there rather than starting with the full whack. Because my thing is, you don't need to replace 100% of sodium loss, because you're probably going to get some back you are going to get it back just through your habitual diet. You're not going to go sodium depleted, are you? And the body retains sodium, as you highlighted, like naturally, like it's smart. So it's like, where do we sit? I mean, where do you think it's going to go in the future with, like, because I know at the moment you guys you recommend the amount, don't you? Do you
we
think
recommend,
it will?
we tend to recommend a relative sodium concentration rather than an amount, because
Okay, so yeah,
I think that's an important distinction, is that you'll see some people recommending total amounts of sodium per hour, but
yeah, which is bad.
that can be dangerous in the sense that it doesn't account for adjustments in fluid intake.
Yeah.
You know, and so we will tend to recommend an appropriate concentration of a drink, assuming that, you know, you're going to adjust the amount of that drink that you take in based on your total sweat rate. So that sometimes, like I say, there's where it becomes a bit counterintuitive is in the example of someone like an Emma Pallant-Brown, or anyone who has a very, very high sweat rate and a low to moderate sweat sodium concentration. We may recommend that they take in a higher sodium concentration in their drink than what they're sweating out, knowing full well that the volume of the total volume of replacement that they're going to put back in is
going to be lower. Yeah.
So the net amount of sodium they're taking will probably still be lower than what they're losing, but the additional sodium in the drink helps to maintain blood sodium levels and maintain blood volume. Whereas you might find the other way around, that, you know, to use the opposite example, you've got someone with a low sweat rate but a high sweat sodium concentration. You probably don't need to recommend, or that person probably doesn't need a high sodium concentration drink. They just need a regular or low sodium strength drink, because the total fluid volume they're taking in is not so high.
Yeah.
So it is a total, like, mind boggler, because you kind of automatically, everyone's default position to start with is like, well, my sweat sodium concentration is this, so that's what I need in my drink. And in a sense, that's not, it's a very logical place to start, and it's often not a particularly wrong place to start, because if you're going to aim to replace a volume of fluid that's kind of equal to or less than what you're sweating out, which is what we'd recommend. We certainly would never recommend you drink more than what you're sweating out. And rarely, if ever, would we recommend 100% replacement. As long as you're drinking something which is of a similar concentration to your sweat, you know, that's logical, because you're essentially putting back in a proportion of what's going out. The body's a fantastic self-regulatory organism. And if you put in roughly the right amount, it's going to absorb what it needs and take care of keeping everything in balance. And it's hard to construct a really, you know, a really solid argument against that approach. Where it falls down in practice is the variability in the actual fluid intake as relates to your actual sweat loss. As you've pointed out, if you're taking a whole smorgasbord of different sports nutrition products, you're also going to be getting sodium in from different places than what's in your drink, and that all of those factors compound. But I think if you're keeping it simple and theoretical, like having a drink that's not far off the concentration of your actual sweat is not completely illogical. You just tend to have to turn it up in terms of sodium concentration if the sweat rates get really, really high, and you can probably comfortably turn it down when the sweat rates are very low, because of that total net loss is going to be lower.
Yep. No, and that's the point of this screen. So this is a screenshot from Fuelin, and this is actually my data. But yeah, you know, I have a decent sweat rate, you know, 1.1 liters per hour. I tend to only drink about half a liter, so I'm taking in probably a little bit lower than the 60% of the amount. But what you can see here, and this is a really important point, I think what you touched on, is that my sodium intake per hour is actually quite low. But because my average sweat rate is 1.1 liter and my average fluid intake is only half a liter, my actual average sodium intake of milligrams per liter is relatively like decent, you know, just under 600 milligrams a liter. And so I think this is where sometimes I think the athletes are getting confused, because you don't have to replace 100% of your sweat rate. And therefore, if you actually go below sort of that 60, 70%, you have to be very aware of how much sodium you're taking in, because it can get very high very quickly, especially if someone's going out and sweating a lot and not necessarily, and taking a lot of sodium, maybe in capsule form, but not replacing any of the fluid loss. Then potentially there are issues that can sort of quickly accumulate. And so I think it is really good to have the data in front of you and do these repeated tests. And all I want to say on this, because I've already covered it, is, you know, as Andy and I have said, is like, look at the guardrails, use it as guardrails. You don't, you know, if we were giving this, there's a line above this, but effectively based on your average sweat rate, we would say 60 to 70% of that average sweat rate would be the recommended fluid intake at this temperature, which is under 30 degrees Celsius on the bike. That would be the recommendation for this athlete, or me in particular. So but it's not an exact, it's 60 to 70%, i.e. around probably 0.6 liters up to 7.7 liters. Somewhere in that range is what's going to actually do me the best. And then I'm going to use thirst as a little bit of a guide to help me through that, as Andy said. When you are recording all this, you want to be recording multiple sessions. So recording the duration, whether it's a bike, a run, a brick, how much fluid loss you know, just by weighing yourself before and after, recording your fluid intake and what products you consume, and also rating things like your thirst rating, GI complaints, because that's going to help you understand like how much fluid you actually require in a race-paced situation or a race-like scenario to maximize your potential race. And I think, like, again, as the last point is, be the scientist. Like what Andy, I think, is doing with their company, I think is really, I think it's great. Like, I think it gives athletes an initial starting point for understanding hydration requirements. I think then you can't just rely on that. You've then got to go and explore. Would you agree with that, Andy? Like, it's about that exploration.
That's absolutely what we're aiming for, is getting people to, you know, getting some data on you in order to allow you to start some really organized trial and error. And then, you know, it's the same process that we would go through with any of the elite athletes that we work with on a kind of consultancy basis. I've put in the chat for anyone who's watching this live a link to the case studies page, because the relative sodium concentrations are recorded for all of those case studies, and then there's discussion. If you click into each one, there's discussion. But and that discussion relates to this in the sense that trial and error process is all of those things that you're alluding to around defining your fluid volume. You then add in different concentration of sodium. You then go out and you test these things in the field, and you basically, you start the trial and error process based on whether your data shows that you're, you know, low sweater, low sodium, high sweater, high sodium, or anything in between. If there was a simple algorithm we could produce where you could punch in, you know, your data and punch out an exact plan, then we would have already done that, you know. And the other thing that we've tried to do with our products is to make them a diverse toolkit for endurance athletes. So we have sodium based drinks with 3 different principal levels of sodium: 500 milligrams per liter relative concentration, 1,000 milligrams per liter relative concentration, and 1,500 milligrams per liter relative concentration. We've got sodium capsules that are 250 milligrams each, and they're the main part of the electrolyte toolkit. And therefore you can, you know, test out based on the data, and also trial and error, which strength is most appropriate for you in different events, different conditions. Alongside that, we've now got the Fuelin range of carbohydrate-based products, which, as you pointed out earlier, very deliberately have 0 electrolytes in, because if you're taking 2 of our gels an hour, which would give you 60 grams of carbs an hour, compared with some of the athletes who are taking 4 gels an hour, if we put sodium in that as well, that's going to confound what you're taking in your drinks. You've got to then adjust your fluid intake around it. We wanted to create this toolkit, which is, you know, essentially you can get carbs from these products, plain and simple. You can get electrolytes in different quantities from these products, and then you can pair these things together to create the recipe that works for your physiology and your event. And, you know, it's not anything, you know, it's not rocket science. It's not hopefully like a fad thing, like a special type of carbohydrate, or you know, it's not based on a kind of new, like you said, a single magic macro or something like that. It's just a toolkit so that you can experiment. Because we always say, you know, if you can get roughly the right volume of fluid in you per hour, along with the requisite amount of sodium if you need some, and the right amount of grams of carbohydrate per hour, that is the basis for fantastic performance. You know, if you get those three things, it sounds so easy when you say it like that, but if you get those three things about right, that's a nutrition plan that supports really, really top performance.
Yep.
And so that's what you've got to focus on. And people get so distracted in sports nutrition with all of these other crazy things that they worry about. But if you nail the basics there, the right amount of fluid, roughly, because your body will deal with it being a few milliliters out here and there, the right amount of sodium, the right amount of carbs, as long as you then pace yourself appropriate to your level of training, then you're going to have a great race. And I think, you know, that's the recipe that we're driving towards, you know. And so hopefully we have the tools like you do. I think that this sweat rate testing thing in the Fuelin app is fantastic because it formalizes that process of recording all that data so that you can build up a library of your testing and have it to fall back. And when someone brings me something like this to look at when they've been doing some testing and they want to talk about their race plan, it makes the process so simple because you know what you're dealing with. I think that's why there's probably a good synergy with what we're doing and what you're doing, because ultimately we're tackling the same problem from two different ends.
Yeah, and look, you know, it might be a bit meticulous and whatnot, but and a bit, you know, a bit of a pain in the ass to do it. But I can tell you now, the athletes who, you know, of the 200 athletes who are currently on the Fuelin program, the ones who have 50 plus sweat tests on the bike, on the run, at race pace in varying temperatures, or at least at the temperature they plan on racing, they do the best. This year, they've had their best season because they understand their individual requirements, and they put the effort in. They didn't rely on anyone else. They worked out what they required through repetitive weighing themselves before and after in the simplest way, recording what they were consuming, recording sodium intake, fluid intake, and then just working it out for themselves. And so it is possible to do. It just takes a little bit of effort, which in today's age sometimes is a bit too much for a lot of people. I know we're over time, and thank you everyone for your patience. Look, I just wanted to say that, you know, I don't like doing a big sell or anything like that, but I do want to let you know what Fuelin is. Fuelin, we go by this simple, personalized and results-driven program. It is based on carbohydrate periodization. So you do receive all your macronutrients from protein, fat, carbohydrates, and total caloric intake required based on your training program delivered by your coach. So it, as I said, it syncs with Training Peaks Today's Plan and Final Surge. It's based around a traffic light system with red is low carbohydrate, yellow is moderate, and green is high. If you see green on your program, you're generally very happy because you get to eat a lot of carbs. It is completely personalized to what the athlete is doing. So rather than a PDF, which, you know, might give you a meal plan that you can follow for a week, this is actually allowing you to have choice around what food you eat based on the requirements of your coach and what you're individually doing. This is a different screenshot, and Andy and I did a Q&A about carbohydrates, but we do a similar thing in terms of carbohydrate capacity testing. You can see at differing temperatures, but, you know, an athlete needs to understand how much carbs they can consume per hour, you know, whether that's fluid, combination of fluids or solids, breaking it down into what type of carbs you prefer, whether it is solids or liquids, and then working out, you know, how you actually cope with that based on the products. I think Precision Hydration and Fuel has some fantastic gels. Really like them. Athletes love them. It is one form of carbohydrate. I think everyone will have differing tastes. I personally like them. They've got a very low flavor profile, very easy to swallow, and they provide 30 grams of carbs. There are plenty of other products on there, and we're not particular with what products you use. I think it comes down again to the individual athlete. If you prefer Morton, if you prefer GU, whatever it is, that's probably the most important thing with this. And what we find with athletes is using what products sit best with you is the best approach. What I will say though is Andy's products do taste very good. So more often than not, athletes switch from some of these other products over to Precision because they just taste really good, and they actually work really well. So again, I'm not associated with Precision. I just like their products. As I said, this is how Fuelin works. You sync your plan, you get your plan delivered to you. You can do a lot of tracking. So you can track carbohydrate capacity. You can track your fluid hydration needs. You can link in Lose It or MyFitnessPal to sync all your macro tracking. And every week we hold sessions like this, Q&As, and you can go on YouTube. You can have a look at the videos that are on there. I think Andy touched on the talk we did with Alan McCubbin about this, and I would highly recommend it. He's quite scientific, but super interesting as well, and gives a nice balance on what we've discussed tonight. Obviously, check out precisionhydration.com. Yeah, fantastic products, fantastic service. A really nice starting point, I think, is their calculator on carbohydrate amounts and sweat rate. I think it gives you a really good beginning. And if you do want to delve into the more detailed sort of performance nutrition, then certainly check us out. There are a few questions. Have to drop out. Cool. Does anyone have any questions? And please feel free to ask. I know we've gone over time, but happy to stay on for the next sort of 10 or so minutes and answer questions. And please don't be shy. I'm sure everyone's thinking the same question. It just usually takes one person to ask it. And feel free to put your cameras on if you like as well. Andy, do you have any follow-ups before anyone asks any questions or anything like that?
I was going to say I've dropped into the chat our email address.
Yeah,
so
perfect.
If anyone has any questions that they think of afterwards, or just want to drop, just doesn't want to talk about them now, then drop us an email to hello@precisionhydration.com, and we'll certainly answer those on a one-to-one basis. But yeah, if anyone's got any
I nearly put your personal email in here, and then I thought I better not do that. You'll get inundated. So
no, it's all good. When we generally, the team here, we're a small team, but we've got a lot of sports scientists in the crew, and we sit around and we chat about all the questions that come in, and we try and get answers back to people really quickly if we can. So, don't feel shy about dropping us a line. But if anyone, as you said, Scott, if anyone's got any questions they want to shout out now, if they want to unmute, or just put them in the chat, and we can spend a few minutes on those.
Here we go. Do you have any starting recommendations in terms of fluid and sodium intake for athletes without access? I mean, I can give my perspective on this and then let Andy. Look, I generally start fairly low. I start somewhere around that 300 milligrams per liter. 300 to 500, depending on taste and depending on how you feel. That's probably where I'd start. And then depending on how you feel during those extended, and again, you probably need to be going for an extended period of time at race pace to start to understand how much fluid you're losing, and then how that amount of sodium starts with. But yeah, somewhere around that 300 to 500, I'd probably start with.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, a huge sort of caveat to that one is like, obviously what kind of environment, what kind of sweat rate, what kind of duration. I would say that I would agree with, lower end 300 to 500 milligrams per liter for, moderate sweat rates, and moderate sweat rates, cooler to moderate conditions, and lower sweat losses. If you feel like, if Mike's question is directed at doing, 6 hours in the extreme heat, and a reasonable default recommendation is to crank it up to closer to 900 to 1,000 milligrams per liter, simply on the basis that it's the middle of the bell curve. That kind of average sweat sodium loss is probably between 900 to 1,000 milligrams per liter. So you're unlikely to be vastly overdoing it at that rate, but you're also very, very unlikely to be, significantly underdoing it. So context is important. And if you want, Mike, and if you want to expand on that question to give us a bit of context about your situation, do drop us a line on that hello@precisionhydration.com, and we can do that. We also offer video calls where we can dive into that one-to-one with you.
Yeah, look, it is tough. We get that question a lot. There are, and just so there is full disclosure, there are other tests that you can do. I will say that a lot of them provide very high sodium concentration estimates from my experience with them, and much higher than even yours, Andy. So I think just be aware of those patches. Make sure if you do speak to those companies, are they doing it site specific, or are they equating for total body sodium concentration? And just be aware that some of those site specifics, depending on where it is, the forearm is not as, is far more reliable than, say, other areas in the body. And sweat rate, for instance, in the forehead is going to be fairly high. So if you are taking it from the forehead as well, because you've got more sweat glands in your forehead, my understanding is you can get overestimations of sweat rate from there as well. So just be aware of that.
Patrick got a question in there. He said, is sweat sodium concentration relatively stable across environmental conditions, or is it variable with heat or cold? I can dive in on that one if you want, Scott.
Yeah, go for it.
I would say broadly, it's fair to say it's relatively stable. So relatively stable within an individual. A big thing that drives how much sodium you lose in your sweat is the way that your sweat glands function. So Alan covered this in his talk, but basically sweat starts off as your blood plasma volume, which is very salty. It moves into the sweat gland and leaches out onto the skin for evaporation. But as part of the process, as it moves through the sweat gland, sodium and chloride are reabsorbed by the body. Now, one of the things that no one fully understands this, but it's thought that the CFTR function, the CFTR channels that reabsorb sodium and chloride in your sweat gland, some people have more of them than others, and some people's function better than others. So me, as someone who loses a lot of sodium in my sweat, if you took a biopsy, you'd probably find that my sweat glands don't reabsorb as much sodium as other people. So what I'm trying to say there is that the largest driver of variability in sweat concentration is probably a genetic factor, hence it's relatively stable. One confounding factor that happens in different environmental conditions, though, is the speed of sweating. So if you sweat at a very, very low rate, your body has more time to reabsorb sodium than if you sweat at a very, very high rate, which you might do in hot conditions. So there are papers out there that demonstrate quite clearly that the same person will lose more sodium in their sweat when they sweat very, very fast compared to if they sweat more slowly. That's why sometimes, there's an argument for highly specific testing. The testing that we do when we look at sweat sodium concentration uses a chemical stimulation for the sweat glands, which causes a very high sweat rate, which is fairly analogous to what you'd experience during hard exercise. So it makes it a good surrogate for us for looking at the sort of concentration you might lose during hard exercise. And we're actually halfway through a study that we're doing in-house in conjunction with the university to look at sweat rates and sweat sodium concentrations at 3 different intensities of exercise. So riding a bike at 50% of FTP, at 75% of FTP, and at FTP. That data will be finished collecting in the next few months, and then hopefully will get published. But the early signs are that we see slightly lower sweat sodium concentration at 50% FTP, slightly higher at 75, and then similar to what we see with the pilocarpine test at around 100% FTP. So long-winded way of answering that question, but I'd say it's relatively stable, but probably increasing with hotter conditions when your sweat rate's going to be higher.
Yeah, I mean, the studies I've seen, and I haven't seen that many on them, but yeah, there is differences in sweat sodium concentration as it gets hotter, and there can be variability in that. So, but as you say, it's probably, is it related to the higher sweat rate and the faster you're sweating because of the higher temperatures or not? So, it's.
I think a point that we try to make some of the time is that it's unusual for us to see individual sweat sodium concentration change dramatically. So if you're a high sweat sodium, if you're like me, if you lose a high amount in cold conditions at a low sweat rate, I'll still lose an amount which is high relative to other people. It might just be a little bit lower than what I normally lose in warmer conditions. So it's kind of about being in a bracket. We talk about t-shirt size. Like if I'm an XL sweater, I'm not suddenly going to become a small sweater in cold conditions. You tend to move around relative to where you would sit on that continuum and not all over the map, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, that's this sort of table again, it's like that. If you focus on taking in the same amount of milligrams per hour, but don't equate for the fluid intake, then it can create issues. And so I think, just coming back to that, like, just be aware of, I think sweat rate is super important to understand. That's where I see a lot of issues with this, is that people can either under or over consume fluid, just through lack of understanding as much as anything. And so I think it's a fascinating space. I think, I think the more research that can come out, Andy, and if Precision is getting involved with universities, I presume something like Loughborough or something like that, is it?
That one's actually a university in the US.
Okay. Yeah.
So we're doing a double cohort. So they're testing a bunch of people on the same protocols that we're testing to make sure that they can replicate, or we can replicate, each other's findings. The other thing that we're actively engaged in at the moment is we're co-funding a PhD student who's going to start at the University of Bedfordshire in the coming months to kind of look to build on some of the work that Alan McCubbin and people like that are doing in investigating individualized sodium replacement for people doing long endurance events, because that's, as Alan identified in his previous talk, there's not a lot of research being done in that area, and we got the opportunity to get involved. So as a co-funder, we don't really we're not able to get involved in influencing the research, as it were, because that would be a conflict of interest. But what we're able to do is get involved in the brainstorming around the kind of questions that should be asked and the methodology around how we might go about looking at it, because we've got some input there from understanding at the coalface what questions athletes are looking to answer in the real world.
Is that going to utilize your machine?
It will utilize, so we use our sweat testing, and probably also some of the new wearable sensors that are coming around, and there may be some patch testing involved as well. So we're going to try and cover a lot of different methodologies while we're doing that study, because if you've got someone in a lab for 5 or 6 hours and you're testing their sweat, you've got ample opportunity to test it in multiple ways and hopefully look at some of the similarities and differences in the numbers that they throw out.
Yeah. Well, I said to Alan as well, and I throw it out to you, I think we've had 2,500 sweat tests performed now within the Fuelin app by individual athletes. And I'm like, we've got to be able to do something with that data at some point. And, and I think this is where, the recommendations provided by athletes, by companies like yourself, where people are actually understanding their sweat rate, their fluid intake requirements, their sodium intake, and then, a lot of it probably will be subjective ratings, but I think there's still value in that. Subjectively, how did you perform? Did you, what was your swim, bike, run times compared to previous when you weren't doing this? Was it better? Yes. Did you feel better? Yes. Did you feel stronger? Yes. Did you cramp? No. Okay. Yeah. Once there's enough data points and they're doing the recommendations, potentially we find out, a little bit more within this space. So yeah, I think it's exciting, and I think we will see more and more of that as it comes out.
Cool.
Right. Andy, look, I won't take any more time up. I'm sure you're very busy, and thank you to everyone who has joined today. Hopefully you've got a lot out of it. I know it's probably opened up more questions than answers, but as Andy said, please feel free to reach out to either of us, and we'll be sure to help where we can. Okay.
Absolutely. And thanks, Scott, and in the Fuelin team for organising the webinar again. I know a lot goes on behind the scenes to make these things happen. So thanks for putting it together.
That's perfect. It's really good. So thank you, everyone. And have a great day. I think it's, what time is it there now? About 11 o'clock?
11:30 in the morning.
Time for lunch, mate.
Almost.
time for me to go to bed.
Yeah.
Very good. Okay. Well, thanks, everyone. And Andy, I'll speak to you soon, mate.